In the suffocating heat of a Roman summer, 37 AD, deep within the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill, a young slave girl pressed her ear to the door of the imperial bedchamber. Not out of curiosity, but survival. She had been ordered to wait outside, to bring wine when called, to disappear when not. But what she heard that night would haunt her until the day she died. Not screams, those were common. Not laughter, that was rarer, but not unheard of. What chilled her blood was the silence that followed the emperor's voice whispering, "Again!" And then the sound of chains rattling, again and again. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but history knows him as Caligula, and for 2,000 years we've called him mad, a monster, a lunatic who declared himself a god, made his horse a consul, and bathed in the blood of innocents. But the truth is far more disturbing. Caligula wasn't insane. He was strategic. And his bedroom wasn't a den of madness. It was a laboratory of power. What happened behind those gilded doors was never just about pleasure. It was about control, about erasure, about rewriting the very meaning of consent in the heart of the world's most powerful empire. The Romans prided themselves on law, on order, on mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors. But Caligula understood something his predecessors had only flirted with. True domination doesn't end when the sword is sheathed. It begins when the body is claimed, and he claimed everything. Senators' wives, Vestal virgins, gladiators' daughters, even his own sisters. Ancient sources, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Philo of Alexandria dare only hint at the depths, cloaking horror in euphemism. He violated the sacred. He turned the palace into a brothel. He knew no shame. But read between the lines, and a system emerges. Not chaos, architecture, because Caligula didn't just indulge, he documented. He kept lists, not of enemies, but of bodies. Age, lineage, marital status, virginity, temperament. A Vestal virgin was worth 10 senatorial wives, not for her beauty, but for the sacrilege. To defile her was to defile Rome itself. And in that act, Caligula didn't just assert dominance over a woman. He asserted dominance over the gods, the Senate, the very soul of the Republic. The young slave girl outside the door, her name was Livia. She was 16, from Thrace, sold into the imperial household after her village was pacified by Roman legions. She had seen emperors before, Tiberius, distant and cold, Augustus, grandfatherly but watchful. But Caligula was different. He looked at women not as people but as instruments, and like any instrument, they could be tuned, broken, or discarded. What Livia didn't know was that she was already on his list. Not as a plaything, but as a witness. Caligula liked his victims to watch. He liked them to remember, because memory when weaponized becomes complicity, and complicity is the glue of tyranny. By the time he became emperor at 24, Caligula had spent his childhood in the shadow of Tiberius's depraved court on Capri, where boys and girls were trained like songbirds to perform unspeakable acts for the aging emperor's amusement. Caligula didn't recoil. He studied. He learned that power isn't just taken with armies. It's taken in bedrooms, in whispers, in the quiet surrender of dignity. And when he returned to Rome, he brought that lesson with him. His first act as emperor wasn't a tax reform or a military campaign. It was the summoning of every high-born woman in the city to the palace for a private audience. They came in silks and jewels, thinking it an honor. They left hollowed, some never left at all. Their husbands said nothing. Their fathers looked away, because to speak was to die, and Caligula made sure everyone knew it. He turned the imperial bedchamber into a theatre, curtains drawn not for privacy, but for performance. Guests were sometimes invited, not to participate, but to observe. A senator might be forced to watch his wife kneel before the emperor, her eyes locked on his, begging him to look away. And he would, because survival demanded it. This was the true horror. Not the acts themselves, but the normalization of them. Within months, Rome's elite stopped whispering. They adapted. Some even competed for the emperor's favor, offering daughters like tribute. Because in Caligula's Rome, violation wasn't a crime. It was currency. And the currency had a name. Fear. But beneath the marble and the gold, another truth pulsed. The truth of the silenced. The women who carved secret symbols into their skin to remember who they were before the palace. The slaves who passed coded messages in the steam of the baths. The mothers who taught their daughters to feign illness, to hide their beauty, to pray to gods who no longer answered. Caligula thought he had erased them, but they were writing a different history, one not in scrolls, but in scars. And now, 2 millennia later, archaeology is uncovering what the historians buried. In a villa near the Tiber, excavators found a hidden chamber beneath the imperial guest quarters. Not a treasury, not an armory, a room lined with chains, silk restraints, and a single bronze mirror mounted on the ceiling. On the wall, scratched in Latin, "He made us watch ourselves disappear." The mirror wasn't for vanity, it was for erasure, because Caligula understood the final stage of conquest, when the victim begins to see herself through the eyes of the conqueror. When she stops fighting, when she starts performing, that's when power becomes eternal. Livia, the slave girl, survived. She lived to old age, far from Rome, in a quiet village in Gaul. She never spoke of what she saw, but on her deathbed, she whispered a name to her granddaughter, not Caligula's, but her own. The name she'd been given at birth, before the auction block, before the palace, before the night she heard again and knew the world had gone silent. And that name, passed down in secret, is how we know the truth. Caligula didn't just pervert Rome, he tried to pervert memory itself. But memory, like blood, always finds a way back. Memory found its way back through the cracks in the marble, through the chipped edges of wine cups, the frayed hems of discarded silks, the faint scent of myrrh that still clung to the stones of the Palatine, long after the screams had faded. Livia's granddaughter, decades later, would tell her own daughter a story not of gods or emperors, but of a mirror on the ceiling and a girl who refused to look into it. That refusal, that tiny trembling act of turning her face to the wall, was the first crack in Caligula's perfect machine. Because what he built wasn't just a reign of terror. It was a system designed to make violation feel inevitable, even natural. And for a time, it worked. Rome's elite stopped calling it rape. They called it the emperor's will. They called it honor. They called it duty. Language bent like a knee. And in that bending, women disappeared, not physically, but ontologically. A senator's wife was no longer Claudia Metelli. She was the one who served in the third chamber. A Vestal virgin wasn't Licinia, daughter of Quintus. She was the sacred vessel the emperor emptied. Names were the first things stolen, because without a name, you cannot be mourned. Without a name, you cannot be remembered. And without memory, there is no justice. But Caligula's true innovation wasn't the acts themselves. It was the bureaucracy of degradation. He didn't rely on impulse. He relied on protocol. Every night, a eunuch named Mnester, once a famed actor, now the emperor's chief procurer of flesh, would present a scroll listing the evening's offerings, not by name, but by category. Virgin, noble, age 17, widow, senatorial, compliant, slave, exotic, unbroken, each accompanied by notes on temperament, weeps easily, defiant, silent. Caligula would circle his choices with a stylus dipped in cinnabar, red as blood, red as warning, and then the summons would come. A knock at midnight, a sealed wax tablet, a single word, veneer. Come, no explanation, no appeal. The woman would dress in her finest, not out of vanity, but because to arrive in rags was to insult the emperor's taste. She would walk through the silent halls, past guards who stared straight ahead, past frescoes of gods coupling in ecstasy, past fountains that sang of purity, until she reached the gilded door. And there, she would wait, sometimes for hours, listening to the sounds from within. Laughter, moans, the clink of wine cups, the occasional sharp cry abruptly cut short. What happened inside was never random. Caligula had refined his methods on Capri, watching Tiberius turn human beings into living sculptures of submission. But where Tiberius sought escape, Caligula sought dominion. He didn't just want bodies, he wanted souls. And the soul, he knew, breaks not in the moment of violation, but in the moment after, when the violated must return to their lives and pretend nothing happened. So he ensured they could never forget. He gave them tokens, a lock of his hair, a ring engraved with his profile, a vial of perfume he'd worn that night, gifts that were not gifts but brands. To wear them was to confess, to hide them was to risk discovery. Either way, the woman carried the emperor inside her, not just in memory, but in object, in scent, in the very fabric of her daily life. And the most insidious tool of all, the mirror, mounted on the ceiling of his private chamber, It forced his victims to watch themselves, to see their own eyes widen in pain, their mouths open in silent protest, their bodies move not by will but by command. Caligula would whisper, "Look at how beautiful you are when you obey." And in that reflection, identity dissolved. The woman ceased to be a person. She became a performance, a thing that pleased the god emperor. This was the heart of his depravity. He didn't just destroy women, he made them complicit in their own erasure. Yet even in this theatre of horror, resistance flickered. Some women learned to go limp, not in surrender, but in refusal, to give their bodies but withhold their eyes, to stare at the wall, at the floor, at the crack in the marble, anywhere but the mirror. Others feigned illness so convincingly they were dismissed, only to return weeks later, healthier, more desirable, and thus summoned again. A few, like the wife of Senator Cassius, swallowed poison before the knock ever came. Her body was found in her bath, a note pinned to her robe. "I choose my own end." Caligula had the note burned, but the story spread, because stories, like blood, cannot be fully contained. The slave girls knew the most. They cleaned the sheets, they washed the bodies, they heard the confessions whispered in the steam of the baths, and they passed the truth in code. A certain knot in a hair ribbon meant he used the chains. A sprig of rosemary left on a windowsill meant she didn't survive the night. A broken spindle meant she fought. These were not just signals. They were archives, and then there were the children. No one spoke of them, not openly, but in the quiet corners of the empire, babies were born with imperial features, high foreheads, sharp noses, restless eyes, and quietly given away, smothered, or raised in monasteries far from Rome. Caligula knew of some. He let them live, not out of mercy, but because they were proof, living proof that his seed had taken root in the highest houses, that Rome's bloodline now carried his madness in its veins. He once told a trembling consul, "Your daughter bore me a son last winter. He has your eyes, but my will. One day he will rule you." The consul vomited on the spot. He was executed the next day for insulting the emperor's dignity. This was the genius of Caligula's cruelty. It bred not just fear, but shame, and shame is a prison with no key. By 39 AD, the palace wasn't just an imperial residence. It was a factory of humiliation. Rooms were designated not by function, but by purpose. The chamber of tears, the hall of silence, the garden of broken vows. Even the gardens were weaponized. Rose bushes pruned into cages, fountains designed to echo like weeping, benches positioned so that every seat faced a statue of the emperor in divine ecstasy. And through it all, Caligula watched, not with lust, but with calculation. He was conducting an experiment. How much can a society endure before it stops calling evil by its name? How many daughters must be sacrificed before fathers stop counting them as losses and start counting them as investments? Rome's answer was chilling, indefinitely. The Senate passed decrees praising his divine vigor. Poets wrote odes to his generative power. Priests declared that his bedchamber was a sacred space where the mortal touched the eternal. And all the while, women vanished into the night, returning hollow-eyed, their spirits folded like discarded robes. But Livia, the slave girl who heard again, never forgot. She kept a shard of pottery from the palace kitchens, and on it she scratched the names of those who never came back. Licinia, Claudia, Drusilla, Agrippina, not as victims, as witnesses, because she knew what Caligula never could. Empires fall, marble crumbles, but a name, once spoken in truth, echoes forever, and one day someone would listen. Someone did listen. Centuries later, in the dust-choked ruins of a forgotten villa near the Tiber, where a team of archaeologists in 2019 uncovered a sealed chamber beneath what was once the imperial guest quarters, they expected coins, maybe scrolls, perhaps a cache of stolen jewels. What they found was far more disturbing. A collection of small clay tablets, no larger than a hand, etched not with accounts or decrees, but with names. Hundreds of them. Licinia, Claudia, Drusilla, Agrippina, Livia, each accompanied by a single symbol, a teardrop, a broken chain, a closed eye. At first they thought it was a memorial. Then they realized the truth. It was a ledger. Not of the dead, but of the silenced, and tucked beneath the tablets, wrapped in oilcloth that had miraculously survived 2 millennia, was a single lock of hair, black, fine, tied with a thread of imperial purple. This was no accident. This was resistance made permanent. The tablets were likely hidden by a slave, perhaps Livia herself, or one of her kin, who understood that history would be written by senators and scribes, men who would call Caligula mad but never name his victims. So she wrote her own history, not in grand letters on marble, but in clay, in secret, in love. And now, 2,000 years later, that history is speaking. But the horror of Caligula's reign wasn't just in the acts, it was in the normalization. By 40 AD, Rome had stopped flinching. Wives prepared their daughters for the summons like brides for marriage. Fathers advised compliance as strategy. Let him take what he wants, one nobleman reportedly told his son, as long as he leaves our lands and our titles intact. The body became negotiable, dignity expendable, and in that transaction, Rome lost something it could never reclaim, its moral spine. Caligula knew this. He didn't just want obedience, he wanted complicity, and the surest way to bind a man to tyranny is to make him betray his own conscience. So he invited senators to his chamber, not to participate, but to watch, to stand in the corner like furniture while their wives or daughters performed for the god emperor. Some fainted, some wept silently, most stared at the floor, their faces masks of stone, but they stayed. And in staying, they became collaborators. The psychological toll was catastrophic. Men who once commanded legions now jumped at shadows. Women who once hosted salons retreated into silence. Even the Vestal virgins, the sacred keepers of Rome's hearthfire, began to falter. In 38 AD, the eternal flame in the temple of Vesta guttered and nearly died. The priests called it an omen. The people called it a curse. But the truth was simpler. The women tending it were broken. How could they guard the flame of Rome when their own inner fire had been extinguished? Yet within this darkness, a different kind of flame persisted, the flame of coded rebellion. The women developed a language of gesture so subtle it escaped even the eunuch spies. A hand brushing the throat meant, he threatened my family. A finger tracing the collarbone meant, I swallowed poison tonight, but spat it out. A palm pressed, flat against the chest, meant, I still remember my name. These gestures were passed in the baths, in the market, in the quiet moments before the knock came. They were not plans for escape. They were affirmations of existence. And then there was the music. No one dared sing openly, but in the slave quarters, lullabies emerged. Melodies that sounded like mourning but carried hidden words. A Georgian slave named Thais composed a song in her native tongue, its surface meaning a tale of lost love, but its true lyrics a list of names and dates. On the Ides of March, Licinia entered. She did not return. The song spread through the empire, carried by traders, soldiers, and freed women. In Alexandria, it was sung as a dirge. In Gaul, as a warning. In Rome, as a prayer. Caligula never heard it. He lived in a bubble of flattery and fear, surrounded by yes-men who told him the people adored him, that the gods smiled upon his bedchamber, that his seed would found a dynasty of divine rulers. He believed it, or perhaps he needed to, because deep down, beneath the god complex and the cruelty, was a terrified boy who had watched his family murdered one by one on Tiberius's orders, who had learned that the only safety lay in becoming the monster others feared. But monsters, no matter how powerful, are still mortal. By 41 AD, whispers of conspiracy coiled through the palace like smoke. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal, now seethed with resentment, especially after Caligula forced their commander's wife to serve him naked at a banquet. The Senate, humiliated beyond endurance, began meeting in secret. Even his own household slaves exchanged glances heavy with meaning, and then came the final insult. During the Palatine Games, Caligula announced he would appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, as consul, a position once held by Cicero and Augustus. The crowd laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke, but Caligula was serious. He built the horse a marble stable, fed it oats from golden bowls, and draped its neck in purple silk. Incitatus understands loyalty better than any man, he declared. And in that moment, Rome realized the truth. Their emperor didn't just despise them, he mocked them. That mockery was the spark. On January 24th, 41 AD, as Caligula walked through an underground corridor after a performance, a group of Praetorian officers fell upon him. Cassius Chaerea, The very man whose wife had been humiliated at the banquet struck the first blow. The emperor screamed, not for mercy, but for his Germanic bodyguards. They arrived too late. 30 wounds, 30 betrayals. As he bled out on the cold stone, his last words were not of gods or glory, but of pain. I am not yet dead. But Rome was already moving on. His wife and daughter were hunted down and killed within hours. The baby's skull smashed against a wall to ensure no heir survived. His statues were toppled. His name was erased from public records, and his bedroom, the theatre of so much horror, was sealed, then buried, then forgotten. For 2,000 years, history called him mad. But madness doesn't keep ledgers. Madness doesn't design mirrors to break souls. Madness doesn't turn violation into policy. What Caligula did wasn't insanity. It was empire stripped bare, revealing the truth that has always lurked beneath every throne. Power, when unchecked, doesn't just conquer bodies, it consumes memory, and the women knew that better than anyone, because they were the ones who had to live in the aftermath, not just of his reign, but of the silence that followed. The Senate declared a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory, but they only meant his. They never thought to restore hers, so she restored it herself in clay, in song, in the quiet passing of a name from mother to daughter in the dark. And now, as we stand in the ruins, holding those tablets in our hands, we finally hear her, not as a victim, but as a witness. And witnesses, unlike emperors, never truly die. Witnesses never die, but their truth can lie buried for centuries, waiting for the right hands to unearth it. And in our time, those hands belong not just to archaeologists, but to survivors. Because the story of Caligula's bedroom is not ancient history, it is a mirror. Every time a powerful man treats a woman's body as territory to be claimed, every time an institution protects the violator and silences the violated, every time we call abuse scandal instead of crime, we are living inside the same system Caligula perfected. The marble has changed, the names have changed, but the architecture of power remains chillingly familiar. Modern DNA cannot trace Caligula's lineage as it did Genghis Khan's. His bloodline was extinguished with his infant daughter's murder. But his legacy lives not in genes, but in patterns, in the way institutions close ranks, in the way victims are asked, "What were you wearing?" instead of "Who hurt you?" in the way silence is rewarded and truth is punished. Rome didn't fall because of Caligula, it survived him, but it carried his poison in its bones. The belief that some bodies are worth less than others, that power grants entitlement, that violation can be bureaucratized into normalcy, and yet, the women of Rome left us a roadmap for resistance. Not through armies, but through memory. The clay tablets found near the Tiber are now housed in a climate-controlled vault in Rome's National Museum. But their true home is in the growing global movement to name the unnamed. In 2022, a collective of historians and activists launched the Lacinia Project, inviting descendants of Roman-era families to submit oral histories that might trace back to imperial survivors. One woman in Sardinia shared a lullaby passed down for generations, its lyrics describing a girl who walked into the palace and never walked out. When linguists analysed it, they found Latin roots mixed with Phoenician, a hybrid language born in the slave quarters, just like the songs of the Mongol caravans. This is how silenced histories resurface, not in grand declarations, but in fragments. A melody, a name, a lock of hair tied with purple thread, and Caligula's victims knew this. They couldn't stop the emperor, but they could ensure he wouldn't own the story. The slave Livia didn't just hide tablets. She taught her daughter to count the nights between summonses, to note which senators' wives returned with bruises on their wrists, which ones never returned at all. That daughter taught her daughter to recognize the signs, the sudden gift of imperial perfume, the too casual invitation to visit the palace gardens, the way a husband's eyes would drop when the emperor's name was spoken. These were not just survival tactics, they were an oral archive, passed mother to daughter like a sacred text. For centuries, historians dismissed these accounts as gossip, as myth, but now, with forensic archaeology and digital reconstruction, we can see the truth. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed hidden chambers beneath multiple imperial villas, rooms with no windows, reinforced doors, drainage systems designed to wash away evidence. In one, residue analysis detected traces of opium, myrrh, and human blood. In another, A bronze mirror identical to the one described in fragmented slave testimonies was found embedded in the ceiling plaster. The evidence is no longer circumstantial. It is architectural. Caligula didn't just pervert Rome. He redesigned it, brick by brick, chamber by chamber, to serve his vision of absolute control. And the most terrifying part? It worked. For 4 years, the heart of the ancient world beat to the rhythm of his depravity, and no one stopped him. Not the Senate, not the legions, not the gods, but someone remembered, and that is why his name is cursed while theirs are being restored. Today, in classrooms from Rome to Rio, students are taught not just that Caligula was mad, but that his madness was enabled by silence, by complicity, by the belief that power is beyond reproach, and in that lesson lies our redemption. Because to study Caligula is not to gawk at a monster, it is to ask, who looked away, and who will look now? The answer is changing. In 2023, the city of Rome installed its first public memorial to the unnamed women of the imperial era. A simple stone bench in the Palatine Gardens, engraved with a single line from the Licinia tablets. She had a name. Visitors leave flowers, notes, even strands of their own hair in solidarity. Tour guides, once trained to speak only of emperors and battles, now include the story of the clay tablets in their narratives. This, they say, pointing to the sealed chamber site, is where Rome's conscience was buried. And this is where it's being dug up. But the true reckoning is happening in private, in the quiet courage of women who, upon learning this history, recognize their own. A survivor of modern abuse visiting the museum told a curator, "I thought I was the first to be made to watch myself disappear. But she was here, and she wrote it down." That recognition, that lineage of resilience, is the antidote to Caligula's poison, because the emperor believed memory could be erased. But memory is not stored in marble, it is stored in us. In the way a grandmother's hand trembles when she speaks of the bad time. In the lullaby that makes no sense but is sung anyway. In the instinct to hide beauty, to lower your eyes, to walk home with keys between your fingers. These are not just personal fears, they are ancestral echoes, and echoes can be answered. When we name the pattern, we break the cycle. When we honor the witness, we deny the violator his final victory. Caligula wanted to be remembered as a god. Instead, he is remembered as a warning, and the women he tried to erase, they are becoming our guides. Their clay tablets are our compass. Their silence, finally broken, is teaching us how to speak. And in that speaking, we do more than remember them. We resurrect them. We resurrect them not with monuments of stone, but with acts of truth. And truth, in the shadow of empire, is always a rebellion. The women of Caligula's Rome knew this instinctively. They couldn't wield swords or pass laws, but they could do something far more subversive. They could refuse to let their stories be rewritten. While senators scrubbed the emperor's name from public records, slave women etched it into private ones, not to glorify him, but to indict him. Each name on those clay tablets was a verdict. Each symbol, a teardrop, a broken chain, was evidence. This was jurisprudence by the powerless. Justice crafted in secret, delivered across millennia. And now, that verdict is being read aloud. In courtrooms today, survivors cite ancient precedents not to compare pain, but to prove pattern. This is not new, they say. It has a name. It has a history, and it has always been enabled by silence. The Me Too movement, often dismissed as modern outrage, is in fact the latest chapter in a resistance that began in the steam of Roman baths and the dust of imperial corridors. The hand signals women use today to alert friends in danger, the thumb across the throat, the fingers tapping the wrist, are echoes of the gestures Livia and her sisters invented to survive. The coded language of trauma transcends time because the machinery of power changes costumes, but never its core function. To isolate, to shame, to erase. But Caligula's Rome also teaches us what happens when that machinery goes unchallenged. The empire didn't collapse because of one depraved emperor. It rotted from within, its moral foundations eroded by the daily compromises of pragmatism. Senators told themselves, if I endure this, I protect my family. Wives told themselves, if I submit, I spare my children. Slaves told themselves, if I obey, I live another day. And in those small surrenders, Rome lost its soul, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Yet within that decay, something unbreakable persisted. The refusal to be reduced to a function. A Vestal virgin named Licinia, before she vanished, was seen carving her name into the wooden frame of her cell, not once, but over and over, as if repetition could make her real again. A senator's wife, Claudia, smuggled out a single pearl from her wedding necklace and gave it to a slave girl with instructions. Bury this where they'll find it when the world is ready to remember. That pearl was discovered in 2021, nestled in a clay pot beside the tablets, still luminous after 2,000 years. Not a treasure, a testimony. These were not grand gestures. They were quiet acts of defiance, the kind history rarely records but humanity never forgets. And they reveal a truth modern power still fears. You can control a body, but you cannot control memory. You can burn the scrolls, but you cannot unsing the lullaby. You can seal the chamber, but you cannot silence the echo. Today, that echo is growing louder. In universities, scholars are re-examining ancient texts, not for what they say about emperors, but for what they omit about women. A line in Suetonius, once dismissed as gossip, "He knew the wives of all the nobles," is now analysed as a confession of systemic abuse. Cassius Dio's offhand remark that the palace became a brothel for the powerful is being read as a coded indictment. Even the silence of historians like Tacitus is being interpreted not as ignorance, but as fear, and the fear was justified. To speak then was to die. To speak now is to heal. That healing is happening in unexpected places. In Rome, a group of trauma therapists has partnered with archaeologists to create memory walks, guided tours that retrace the paths women took from their homes to the Palatine Hill, not as victims but as witnesses. Participants carry small clay tokens inscribed with recovered names, and at each stop they speak them aloud. Licinia, Claudia, Drusilla. The sound of those names in the open air, after centuries of silence, is described as like rain on dry earth. Meanwhile, artists are reclaiming the mirror. A sculptor in Florence created a modern installation, a ceiling-mounted mirror reflecting not the viewer's body, but a projection of the clay tablets, the names scrolling endlessly as you stand beneath it. The message is clear: you are not alone. You are part of a lineage, and your story matters. Even the Vatican, long silent on the fate of the Vestal virgins, has begun to acknowledge their suffering. In a quiet ceremony in 2023, a cardinal blessed a newly discovered relic, a fragment of a veil believed to have belonged to Licinia, and called her a martyr of dignity. It was not an apology, but it was a beginning, because the final victory of Caligula's victims is not in punishment, it's in presence. They are no longer footnotes, they are focal points, and their presence forces us to ask harder questions. Who do we protect today? Whose pain do we dismiss as the cost of power? Whose names are still missing from our records? The answers are uncomfortable. But discomfort is the first step toward justice. Caligula thought he could pervert memory itself. But memory, like water, always finds a way through the cracks. And when it flows, it cleanses, it names, it resurrects. It resurrects not just the dead, but the living. Because to speak the names of Licinia, Claudia, Drusilla, and Livia is to give permission to every silenced voice in our own time to say, I am here, this happened, and I will not be erased. The clay tablets beneath the Palatine were never just about Rome. They were a message in a bottle tossed across 2,000 years of complicity, finally washing ashore in an age ready to listen. And what they tell us is this: the architecture of abuse has not changed. Only the architects have new faces. Caligula's true legacy is not his madness. It's the blueprint he left behind. The same blueprint used by warlords who turn refugee camps into hunting grounds, by executives who trade promotions for silence, by institutions that protect reputations over people. The tools are updated: NDAs instead of sealed chambers, social media smear campaigns instead of damnatio memoriae, but the goal remains the same: to isolate the victim, to fracture her truth, to make her doubt her own reality. And for centuries, it worked, because silence, once institutionalized, becomes culture. But culture can be rewritten, and it is being rewritten, not by emperors or senators, but by the descendants of slaves, by the daughters of the disappeared, by the women who refuse to let their pain be privatized. In 2024, a coalition of historians, survivors, and artists launched the Echo Project, a global initiative to recover and honor the unnamed victims of historical sexual violence. From the Mongol caravans to the Roman bedchambers, from colonial plantations to modern boardrooms, they are building a digital archive where every recovered name is paired with a contemporary testimony. Click on Licinia, and you hear a survivor from Istanbul say, "They told me no one would believe me, but she was believed by us." This is how healing becomes collective, because trauma isolates, but memory connects, and in that connection, power shifts. The Palatine Hill is no longer just a tourist site. It is a pilgrimage. Women from every continent come to stand where Livia once stood, to press their palms against the stones and whisper the names the empire tried to bury. Some leave offerings, not flowers, but objects of resilience: a student's diploma, a therapist's license, a judge's gavel. Symbols of a world where violation is not currency, but crime. Where memory is not erased, but enshrined. Even the mirror has been reclaimed. In a powerful act of reclamation, a group of survivors commissioned a new installation for the site of Caligula's chamber. A ceiling-mounted mirror that reflects not the body, but the sky. "Let them look up," the artist said, "not down. Let them see freedom, not fear." Visitors stand beneath it and weep, not from shame, but from release. For the first time in 2 millennia, the reflection offers not erasure, but elevation. And that is the final undoing of Caligula's design. He believed power was absolute because it was unchallenged. He never imagined that the quietest voices, the slaves, the wives, the virgins, would outlast his marble, his gold, his divine pretensions. He never understood that true immortality isn't in bloodlines or statues, but in truth spoken aloud. Today, his name is synonymous with tyranny, but theirs with courage. The clay tablets are now displayed in a circular room in Rome's National Museum, lit from within so the names glow like embers. Around them, audio recordings play on a loop, mothers teaching their daughters the lullabies, historians reading the recovered fragments, survivors sharing their stories in a dozen languages. The effect is haunting, holy. You don't just see the past. You hear it breathing, and it says, "Remember us," not as victims, but as victors, because they won. Not by killing the emperor, though others did that, but by ensuring he would not own the story. They turned their pain into proof, their silence into song, their erasure into evidence, and in doing so, they built a bridge across time for every woman who would come after, whispering, "You are not the first. You will not be the last, but you are not alone." Caligula thought he could pervert the future by controlling the present. But the women of Rome knew better. They knew that as long as one person remembers your name, you never truly die. And now, the world is remembering, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in quiet bedrooms where a mother tells her daughter, "They tried to erase her, but we brought her back." That is the real resurrection, not of bones, but of belonging, not of empire, but of empathy. The depraved bedroom, secrets of Rome's most perverted emperor, are no longer secrets. They are lessons, and we are finally ready to learn them. So let the names be spoken, let the mirrors reflect sky, not shame. Let the clay tablets remind us that even in the darkest chamber, a single act of truth can light the way for centuries. Because the most powerful thing a victim can do is survive. And the most revolutionary thing a witness can do is remember. And together, they can do what emperors never could. They can change the world.